can't buy me love. Everybody tells me so, can't buy me love. No, 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 no. Tell me you don't need no diamond ring, and I'll be satisfied. Tell me that you want the kind of things money just can't buy. I don't care too much for money. Money can't buy me love. Yeah, I think that's true. You can't really buy love with money. But if you have money, you probably should spend it on those you love. A number of years ago, I read a story and I liked it. You might have read it too in high school, maybe even middle school. My story is a variant on that one called You Can't Take It With You. Martha was a good wife. Well, good in the framework of the time in which she lived. Good through the eyes, from the perspective of those at the time who decided what made a good wife. Martha was hardworking, diligent, faithful, modest, humble, obedient. Martha's husband, Harold, was a good husband. Again, in the framework of the time in which he lived, from the perspective, through the eyes of those in society who made the decision of what made a good husband. Harold was hardworking, industrious, intelligent, strong, faithful. Now, Martha and Harold both had their faults. Martha was honest. And I know what you're thinking. What's wrong with that? Well, she was honest to a fault, as you will soon learn. Harold's fault was that he was frugal. Frugal? No, he was cheap. Cheap? He was miserly. Harold would have made Ebenezer Scrooge look like a philanthropist. Martha would plead with him. Harold, please, can't we buy just a little bit more wood to get us through the winter? The water is frozen in the basin. It's warm enough in this house. That's what blankets and sweaters are for. Harold, can't we just have a little bit more money to spend on our food allotment? Poor Martha had to buy the least expensive cuts of meat and small portions. She would go to the vegetable market and wait for the limp vegetables that were ready to be thrown out and purchase them. And at the baker's, only the days old bread. She would, in her kindest, nicest way, plead with him. Harold, look at my jacket. It's so old, it's threadbare. I need a new jacket. Harold would smile. Oh, here's a dime. Buy a few spools of thread and a new needle. That jacket will last you many, many years. Now, it would be easy to hate Harold, but he lived in that same cold home, ate the same food, no more, no less, and his own jacket was threadbare. This jacket was my father's and his father's before him. It'll last me my lifetime. And that's just the way he was. Now, it wasn't as if he didn't have the money. He had he had lots and lots and lots of money. You see, Harold worked from sunup to sundown 7 days a week in the financial sector, and he was very smart, made lots of money. What did he do with his money? Some of it he would leave in banking institutions and reinvest, but most of it he would convert to $100 bills. And then, in the middle of the night, quietly, secretly, taking only a small candle, He would sneak out to the carriage barn that was now in the woods covered with trees, the carriage barn that in the old horse and buggy days was used to store the buggy. But now it was just a place to throw old junk, a place where dust and cobwebs collected. Harold would sneak in the middle of the night and take those $100 bills and lift a giant oak piece of the floorboard and stick those $100 bills down there. Nobody knew about it. Well, Martha knew about it. Martha was smart. She could see what he was doing. But, well, she said nothing. And do you think she would go and sneak out one of those $100 bills and cash it and spend a little bit of it on herself? Or take a sack full of those $100 bills and leave and never to return? No. Martha, as I told you, was honest to a fault. She had been brought up in a devout home where every day from the time she could speak, she learned to pray and never to steal, never to take anything that wasn't hers. She prayed to every saint she knew, and she knew many. And at the end of every prayer, she would say, "And please, help me find a better life." And yet, that better life never seemed to come. And she could never bring herself to tell a lie, to take a penny that wasn't given to her freely. Now, Harold was quite a bit older than Martha, and there came the day when he had to visit the doctor, which was unusual. The doctor? I don't need any doctor to give him $1 to tell me that I'm fine. No. But he had to go to the doctor, and the doctor, after examining him in his most serious, sober voice, told him, "Harold, it's time you got your affairs in order, and quickly." And so Harold knew it was his time. So what did he do? The first thing he did was to take all of his money out of those banking institutions, convert them to $100 bills, bring them into his carriage barn and stick them with the others. The second thing he did was to hire a young carpenter, a local fellow. He commissioned him to build him a coffin. The young man looked at Harold. "Oh, I have some pecan wood. I've been saving it for just the right job. No. Pine will do." "Pine? I have some chestnut. Oh, it would make a wonderful coffin." No, my good man. Pine will suffice." Harold knew pine would be the cheapest wood to buy. Well, the young fellow realized he wasn't going to make too much money on this job, but Harold did spare an expense. When the young man began taking measurements, "Oh, no need to. I have the specifications right here. I've written them down for you." And the young fellow looked at the sheet of paper and looked at Harold. "Oh, no, sir. These aren't right. They're correct. But, sir, you've made this coffin much too long. It's much too long for a man your height. And the width, why, I could put the largest man I know in here with room to spare. And it doesn't need to be this deep." The young fellow was an honest carpenter. And now Harold felt he had to explain. "Well, it's like this. You see, I'm claustrophobic. I hate to admit it, but the thought of being in that box in the ground covered with the dirt, it just takes my breath away. And while I'm alive, I want to have peace of mind." And that was enough to satisfy the curiosity of the carpenter. So he left, built the coffin, brought it back, set it up on 2 sawbucks inside the carriage barn. And now Harold commissioned an elderly woman, someone he knew from the neighborhood, his community, someone he knew would work for just a few pennies. And he commissioned her to make a lining for the coffin. "I want it lined It doesn't matter what fabric, gingham, calico, denim, whatever is the least expensive. And I want the sides, the front, the back, the floor of the coffin, I'd like it lined. And I want you to use lots of fabric so that it will billow out. I'm going to stuff the coffin. Well, the old woman did not understand. Well, sir, the coffin really doesn't need to be lined, and why would you need to stuff it? And now Harold felt he needed to explain. Well, it's like this. I hate to admit it, but the thought of being in the cold ground and being cold all the time, why, it just makes me feel cold now. And while I'm alive, I want to have peace of mind. So I'm going to insulate the coffin. I'm going to stuff it with sawdust, like the old ice houses were. When the old woman heard ice house, her eyes lit up. The ice house. Oh, I remember the ice house when I was a little girl. It was a great barn, and the walls were lined with sawdust this thick. And that ice, those blocks of ice, stayed as good. They were solid at the end of August. And so that explanation satisfied the old woman. Now, I guess you figured out what Harold's plan was. Yup, he was going to take his fortune with him. Now, don't try to ask me to explain that. I don't understand it. But even those pharaohs, those kings and the queens of ancient Egypt, they bury themselves with all of their possessions, their brass, their silver, their jewelry, their gold. Instead of giving it away, they buried themselves with all their possessions. And that's what Harold was going to do. You see, every time someone said, Harold, you work so hard, you make so much money, why don't you treat yourself? Go on a vacation, buy some new clothing, do something nice for Martha, buy a new house. You know, you can't take it with you. Oh, every time he heard someone say, you can't take it with you, he bristled. Can't take it with me. I can take it with me. I worked hard for this money. I am taking it with me. And that was his plan. Now, Harold had one more thing to do. He called his wife to his side. Martha, you've been a good wife. I've left provisions for you in my will. And he smiled graciously. The house will be yours. Martha forced a wan smile on her lips. The house, she thought. This old dump. Every time something went wrong with it, oh, the walls are fine. We'll just stuff the cracks with newspaper and rags to stop the wind. The roof, I'm not going to pay someone to go up there and cheat me on putting a whole new roof on. No. Just move those buckets to collect the rainwater. It's fun. And then he said, and there will be a monthly allotment for you to live on. And Martha knew that it would be just a small amount. Small? It was a pittance. It wasn't even half of what she lived on now because, there was only one of them. And Martha knew with that little bit of money, living in this cold house, well, it would just be a matter of time before she was following him. Now, Martha, I'm going to ask you to make a promise. You know I've worked hard for my money, my fortune, and I want to take it with me. You must promise that you will not interfere. Promise me, Martha. I promise. And promise me, Martha, that you won't tell another living soul. Martha had already been planning. I promise. And promise me, Martha, that you'll stay with me. When the lid of the coffin is tacked on, stay with me until I am completely buried. Promise. I promise. And now Harold sighed and smiled, knowing that he could leave because he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that no matter what, Martha would not break her promise. And so, the next morning when Martha woke up, he was as white as a bedsheet, as stiff and cold as a chunk of wood. And she was good to her word. She waited until the body was placed in the coffin and the lid was tacked on. She stayed with the body as it went to the church. It was a short service. The priest didn't stay long. He said a few words. He only got a few coins. No donation to the church. The few neighbors who came, they left immediately because no money was left for a repast. Martha accompanied the body to the cemetery and watched as it was lowered in the ground and covered with rocks and soil and gravel and dirt. She waited until the grave diggers patted the mound and left. And now Martha went home. The first thing she did was to make herself a big mug of tea. She looked at the used tea bag that had been used many times, and she chose a new one. She took a second, and then she smiled as she sipped her tea and made her plans. The first thing I'm going to do is sell this old house. No, I will not sell it. I will find a young couple in love, a young man who's ambitious and who will work with his hands to make this house into a home. And I will give this house to them. And she smiled at the thought of it. And then she took a sip of her tea and looked down at her feet at the large, very large, open suitcase. And then I will travel. Oh, I've always wanted to see California. I will go to California first. And then I will travel abroad. I will go to England, France. Oh, I want to see the Eiffel Tower. I will spare no expense. I will eat at the finest restaurants, sleep at the best hotels. I will never be cold again. And she sipped her tea and smiled and looked down at the large, open suitcase at her feet. The large, open suitcase that was filled with $100 bills. Not 100 of them, not 1,000, 10,000 $100 bills. $1 million. And now Martha sipped her tea and smiled. How proud I am that I was able to keep my promise and bury Harold with his fortune. And now she remembered how when she had found Harold, as white as a bedsheet, as stiff and cold as a chunk of wood, how she had immediately raced to the carriage barn, how she had taken all the money that Harold had stuffed. I mean, she knew where he had put the money. She watched every night as he walked to the carriage barn with that little candle. She took all those $100 bills out and put them into the suitcase and dragged the suitcase back to her house. And then she remembered how she had run back to the carriage barn with her arms filled with her old blouses and her underwear and her socks that she had darned and darned and damned and darned and damned and darned over and over and over again. She remembered how she had stuffed them into the lining of the coffin. And it was only then that she remembered she called the coroner to come. And as the coroner, the funeral director, prepared the body, she remembered how she had sat at this very table and dipped her pen into the inkwell and wrote out a check. Pay to the order of Harold Johnstone in the amount of $1 million. She remembered how she had, in her finest penmanship, carefully and neatly signed her name, Martha Johnstone. She remembered blowing on that ink to dry it. It must look perfect. It is perfect. She remembered folding it and then telling the coroner to wait. I have a little note from my husband. She remembered slipping it into his jacket pocket, just as the lid of the coffin was placed on top and tacked down securely. And now Martha continued to sip her tea and smile. I'm so proud of myself. Harold is buried with his fortune. And now it is up to him whether he decides to cash that check or not. I don't care too much for money. Money can't buy me love. Yeah, money can't buy you love. But if you have the money, spend it. Spend it on those you love, because you can't take it with you.